The community hall in Montgomery, Alabama, was usually a place of warmth and familiarity, a space for weekend gatherings, choir practice, and town meetings. But tonight, there was a different energy in the air. The folding chairs scraped softly against the polished wood floors as a diverse crowd settled in, their hushed conversations creating a low hum of anticipation. At the front of the room stood Richard Caldwell, a man whose towering presence and well-rehearsed hand gestures were recognized by all. His speeches were known for their confidence and unwavering stance on controversial topics. But tonight, there was a weight to his demeanor, a sense that this evening would be different. The audience consisted of families, retirees, and curious locals eager to hear his words. Yet among them, one figure stood out, not because of her size, but because of the quiet intensity in her eyes. 8-year-old Maya, dressed in a neatly pressed blue dress, clutched an old worn book against her chest. It was a cherished possession, passed down from her grandmother, its pages creased from years of turning. Before arriving, her mother had leaned down and whispered. Maya had nodded, her heart pounding. She had been preparing this question for weeks, scribbling it in her notebook at school, whispering it to herself at night. It wasn't the kind of question children asked out of mere curiosity. It was something much deeper. Richard Caldwell began his speech, speaking of policies, progress, and the future of the country. The audience nodded, clapped in intervals, but the usual electricity of his rallies wasn't there. Maya waited, her small fingers gripping the cover of her book as if drawing strength from it. Finally, the time for questions arrived. A line formed. Quickly, adults stepping forward with concerns about their neighborhoods, policies, and economic struggles. Some even took the opportunity to praise Caldwell's suit and strong leadership. Maya hesitated. Her legs trembled. She could feel the stares around her. But when her mother gave her a gentle nudge, she knew this was her moment. She stood, her little frame barely noticeable at first. But as she moved forward, the murmurs in the room quieted. People turned. They saw her, the small black girl. The oversized book pressed tightly against Maya's chest as she stepped forward, her small hands trembling. A hush fell over the room, whispers spreading as people took notice of the little black girl standing in line among the towering adults. When her turn came, Richard Caldwell's gaze softened as he looked down at her, a brief flicker of curiosity crossing his face. The crowd, once murmuring and restless, now focused entirely on the unexpected presence of a child. Maya's grip on the book tightened, her knuckles turning pale as she steadied herself. The question that had lived in her heart for so long, finally, escaped her lips. The silence was instant and absolute. A weight settled over the hall, an invisible force pressing down on every person in the room. Richard Caldwell, a man known for his sharp retorts and unyielding presence, did not respond immediately. He simply looked at her, then at the book she held so tightly. His shoulders, usually squared with unwavering confidence, shifted slightly, as something flickered behind his eyes. The room, once filled with polite murmurs and shifting chairs, seemed frozen in time. Even the air felt heavier, thick with anticipation. Caldwell's silence stretched longer than anyone expected. The man, who always had something to say, who had built his career on certainty and quick responses, was momentarily without words. His gaze returned to the worn edges of the book Maya held, his expression unreadable. He parted his lips, but for a moment no sound came. Maya, standing so small before him, felt the intensity of every eye in the room. Her question had not been meant to challenge or confront. It was born of sincere curiosity, an innocent desire to understand something far greater than herself, and in that innocence, there was a power that no argument or speech could match. The audience remained perfectly still. The usual background noises, the occasional cough, the creaking of chairs, the shuffling of feet, had disappeared. The entire Hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Richard Caldwell exhaled slowly, raising a hand slightly as if to steady himself. He leaned against the podium, his usual commanding posture softening. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, steadier, yet lacking the confidence that usually defined him. His words carried a weight different from any of his speeches, an admission that no one had expected. Richard Caldwell's gaze returned to Maya, and for a brief moment, something in his expression softened, almost paternal. He studied her, this small girl standing before him, with an oversized book pressed to her chest, her eyes unblinking, waiting. He exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the podium. Then, as if reaching back through time, his voice took on a different tone. When he was around her age, he had questions about faith, too. His parents had taken him to church every Sunday, where he would sit in the pews, staring up at the stained glass windows, wondering if God was truly listening. He paused, his eyes sweeping over the crowd as if measuring their reaction. His hand rested on the wooden podium, fingers drumming absently. His father had once told him that faith was like a ladder, something to be climbed one step at a time. Sometimes it felt unsteady, as if one wrong step would send you falling. But still you climbed because there was something at the top worth reaching for. As a child, he hadn't understood. Back then, it had seemed like just another thing adults said to quiet children's endless questions. A faint chuckle rippled through the audience, easing the weight in the room ever so slightly. But Maya didn't smile. She wasn't looking for amusement. Her gaze stayed locked on Caldwell, waiting for the real answer, the one she had come for. His posture shifted, his voice lowering. As he grew older, life had thrown challenges at him. Failures, losses, moments where moving forward seemed impossible. And in those moments, he hadn't always felt like God was there. Sometimes he had been angry, questioning everything. Other times, he had wondered if maybe God had given up on him altogether. The room remained utterly still, the usual rehearsed responses and carefully crafted speeches replaced by something raw, something unexpected. This wasn't the confident, unwavering rhetoric they were used to hearing. This was something real. But even in his lowest moments, when he felt most alone, he had come to realize that faith wasn't about having all the answers. It was about believing in something greater, even when the path ahead wasn't clear. Even when the full picture remains unseen, there is purpose, something greater at work. Richard Caldwell's voice carried through the silent room, his words landing with a weight that no one had expected. His gaze returned to Maya, and for the first time since she had stepped forward, the grip on her book loosened slightly. Her wide, dark eyes shimmered under the harsh fluorescent lights. To him, faith was that purpose. It was the reminder that, no matter how many times someone fell, no matter how badly they failed, they were never truly finished. It was the voice that told them to keep climbing, even when the ladder felt like it was going to break. The room, still as ever, seemed to hold on to his words, but before they could fully settle, something shifted. A single tear slid down Maya's cheek. The quiet murmur of the audience grew, an almost imperceptible ripple spreading through the room. Clutching the old, worn book tighter against her chest, Maya's small shoulders trembled. This was not sadness. It was something deeper, something she hadn't known had been waiting inside her. Caldwell's words had reached a part of her heart she had guarded for so long. Beside her, her mother placed a gentle hand on her back, whispering softly. But Maya shook her head. This was not a moment to be soothed away. It was something she needed to feel. Caldwell, noticing her reaction, took a step away from the podium. His usual commanding presence softened, his face marked by something quieter, something unfamiliar. He asked for her name, his voice measured. Maya. The name barely escaped her lips, fragile yet firm. He repeated it with a faint smile, as if savoring its weight. Sometimes the simplest questions were the hardest to answer, he admitted, and sometimes they reminded people of what truly mattered. Maya's voice wavered, but she did not look away. Her grandmother had told her the same thing, that even when silence was all someone could hear, God was always listening. Caldwell's expression shifted ever so slightly. There was something unspoken in his eyes, a mixture of understanding and something more. The room was utterly still, every word pressing down on the audience like a weight they hadn't expected to carry. For a moment, Maya was no longer just a little girl with a book in her hands. She was something more, something bigger than herself. Her quiet courage had shifted the energy of the entire evening, turning what had begun as a simple gathering into something deeply personal, something raw. Richard Caldwell's voice, though steady, had lost its usual edge. He spoke not as a man addressing a crowd, but as someone who had been made to confront something uncomfortable. People spent their lives searching for answers in places they thought would fill them. Power, success, wealth. But the real answers were the ones that made them uneasy, the ones that forced them to ask, what do I stand for? What do I believe in? And who am I when no one else is watching? His gaze returned to Maya, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. She had reminded him of something important, something most adults had long since forgotten. The crowd erupted into soft applause, but Maya barely seemed to notice. The tears that had filled her eyes had dried, replaced with something stronger, a quiet pride. She wiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her dress and turned toward her mother, whose own eyes glistened with emotion. But as the applause faded, the moment wasn't over. The air in the room shifted, an unspoken tension pulling everyone back into the story that was still unfolding. Caldwell's expression darkened slightly, his usual confidence giving way to something heavier. He scanned the room before settling, his eyes back on Maya, his voice lowering. There was a time, he admitted, when he had believed he had everything figured out. He had ambition, he had plans, he had the drive to succeed. But then there was a moment, a single moment that had shattered that illusion. The audience leaned forward, hanging on to every breath between his words. Caldwell rarely spoke about his personal life, and now it seemed as though he was about to let them in. He spoke of his brother, Daniel, a man full of kindness, of light, a goodness that Caldwell had not fully understood at the time. But Daniel had struggled. He had demons that no one could fight for him. No matter how much his family had tried, no matter how much they had hoped, it hadn't been enough. For a brief second, Caldwell's voice faltered. He cleared his throat, pushing forward. When Daniel had passed, he had been angry. Angry at himself, angry at the world, and most of all, angry at God. How could someone so full of life, someone with so much to give, be taken so soon? Maya didn't move, didn't shift in her place. She simply watched him, her young face carrying an expression far beyond her years. And in that moment it was clear. This conversation was no longer just about faith. It was about loss. It was about what it meant to hold on, even when everything else told you to let go. The air in the room felt heavier, charged with something unspoken, yet deeply understood. Maya stood still, her fingers wrapped tightly around the book in her hands, as if holding on to something larger than herself. Richard Caldwell's words had reached her in a way she hadn't expected, shaped by grief, softened by hope, and laced with a truth that had settled deep in her heart. Others in the room seemed just as captivated, their expressions shifting between empathy and quiet reflection. Caldwell exhaled, his hand gripping the podium as if steadying himself against the weight of his own memories. For a long time, he had turned away from faith. If there was a higher power, Why would it take someone like Daniel and leave him behind? He had spent years wrestling with that question, bitterness settling into the spaces where belief once lived. But then something had changed. A dream. A memory. A moment he couldn't quite explain. One night he saw Daniel's face, bright, smiling, just as he had been in life. And he heard his brother's voice, clear as day, telling him not to be angry, telling him there was still work to do. The room was silent, absorbing every word, the weight of his grief pressing against them all. The hum of passing cars outside seemed to disappear, leaving only the sound of collective breaths held in anticipation. Faith, Caldwell said, wasn't about having all the answers. It wasn't about understanding everything. It was about trust. It was about believing that even in pain, even in loss, there was purpose. Maybe Daniel's purpose had been to teach him that. Maybe every hardship carried a lesson waiting to be found. He turned his gaze back to Maya, his expression softening. So when she asked him what faith meant to him, his answer was simple. Faith was the reason he kept going. It was the force that reminded him they were here for more than just themselves. The quiet push that told them to stand, even when they wanted to fall. Maya's eyes shimmered again, but this time no tears fell. Instead, she stood taller, the book in her arms, now feeling even more precious, as though it carried the weight of everything she had just learned. Just as the room began to settle into the gravity of the moment, a voice from the back broke the silence. A man, rugged and weathered by time, slowly stood. His presence was unassuming, someone you might pass on the street without much thought. A mechanic, maybe. A father. A man who had been to church when life allowed but had never quite found the answers he was looking for. His voice, however, carried weight. He spoke carefully, his words deliberate. He had spent years trying to understand his own faith. But after hearing Caldwell speak of doubt, anger, and hope, he wondered, was the real problem that people were too afraid to admit they were struggling? The question lingered in the air, raw and real. Caldwell didn't hesitate for long. He leaned forward slightly, meeting the man's gaze. People, he said, wanted to seem strong. They wanted to act as if they had everything figured out. But faith wasn't easy. It was messy. It was uncertain. And sometimes it felt like screaming into the void, hoping for an answer that might never come. But that struggle, that fight to believe despite the uncertainty, was what made faith powerful. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about trying. A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Heads nodded. A few murmurs of quiet understanding filled the space, and then, in the midst of it all, Maya's voice rose again. My grandma used to say, faith is like planting seeds, she said. Her words were clear, steady, stronger than before. You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe they will. It shows up in the quiet ones, the moments when you're alone, when no one's watching, when you're at your lowest and you think no one hears you. But that's when faith is strongest, when it whispers instead of shouts. The room was utterly still. Lily's grip on her grandmother's Bible had loosened entirely now, her small hands resting lightly over its worn cover. The older woman who had spoken of her grief wiped at her eyes, nodding slowly. Others around her murmured in quiet agreement, some leaning in to share knowing glances, as if recognizing something in each other they hadn't before. Trump exhaled, his shoulders lowering just slightly, as if the weight of the moment had settled into him too. I'll tell you something else, he continued, his voice steady but softer than before. Faith isn't about never questioning. It's about questioning and choosing to believe anyway. A younger man in the front row leaned forward, his brow furrowed. But what if you just don't feel it? He asked hesitantly. What if you want to believe but it's just not there? Trump nodded, considering the question. "That's the hardest part, isn't it?" he said. "Wanting to believe but feeling like you can't." He paused for a long moment, then gestured toward Lily. "But maybe that's where faith starts, with just a little bit, just enough, to ask the question. Just enough to want to believe." Lily's eyes widened slightly, her lips parting as if to say something, but she hesitated. Then slowly she nodded. Trump smiled, genuine and unguarded. "That's the seed," he said simply. "And sometimes that's enough." The room felt different now, not just a gathering of individuals, but a shared moment of understanding. Whatever people had come searching for that night, it seemed they had found something. If not answers, then at least the comfort of knowing they weren't alone in the asking. As individuals left, feeling like something had connected them in a way they hadn't expected. Lily glanced up at her mother, who smiled down at her with pride. The Bible that had felt so heavy in her arms earlier now seemed lighter, not because its weight had changed, but because something inside her had. Trump stepped back from the podium, his expression thoughtful as he took in the faces before him. For a moment, it wasn't about politics or speeches. It was about something deeper, something that had started with the simple, honest question of a young girl. As people began to gather their things, murmuring amongst themselves, some lingered, reluctant to let go of the moment. The older woman who had spoken of her loss clasped the younger man's hand beside her, as if drawing strength from his presence. Across the room, the mechanic who had spoken earlier nodded at Lily with quiet respect. Trump made his way toward the exit, stopping briefly to place a hand on Lily's shoulder. "Never stop asking questions," he told her. "That's how faith grows." Lily beamed, gripping her grandmother's Bible once more, but this time with the quiet confidence of someone who knew she wasn't alone in her search for answers. And as the town hall emptied, the night didn't feel like just another event. It felt like something that would linger, like a seed planted in the hearts of everyone who had been there, waiting to grow. The room, once filled with division and routine expectations, now carried a different energy. People lingered, exchanging quiet glances and soft-spoken words, as if something unspoken had connected them all. Lily stood beside her mother, still clutching her grandmother's Bible, her small fingers tracing the worn edges of its cover. Trump, instead of walking straight toward the exit, stepped away from the podium and approached her. He knelt slightly, meeting her eyes, and after a brief moment of silence, he spoke in a voice softer than before, telling her that she had more courage than most people twice her age, and that she should never lose it. Lily hesitated only for a moment before extending her small hand, thanking him, not just for speaking, but for answering. Trump shook her hand gently, a faint smile crossing his face before he stood again, turning back toward the crowd and giving one final wave as he left the stage. The room did not return to its usual murmur of polite chatter. Instead, it remained alive with something deeper, conversations that carried meaning. Strangers who had come with nothing more than their opinions, now finding themselves sharing quiet moments of understanding. As the doors closed behind him, Lily turned to her mother, her voice small but steady, asking if Grandma would have been proud. Her mother, tears glistening in her eyes, assured her that she wouldn't have just been proud, she would have been amazed. Slowly, the hall emptied, but the moment lingered. Tonight was not just about politics, nor was it simply about faith. It was about the courage to ask the hardest questions and the power of an answer that could change everything. And in that quiet realization, the people who had gathered left with something unexpected, pieces of themselves they hadn't known were missing.